So we have come to the final conclusion for this workshop. My final words of advice. First of all, you would have noticed that not all suttas can be taken at face value because of how they were compiled. You may know that there were no recorders, nor even writing materials during the Buddha's time that were used to record his teachings. For the first 500 years or more, his teachings were transmitted orally by the monks from generation to generation. In order to preserve the Buddha's teachings through the oral tradition, you cannot simply record verbatim whatever the Buddha said. For example, in this workshop, look at their level of comprehension and retention. So low for some of you. In order for the oral tradition to preserve the teachings, what they did was to summarize the teachings of the Buddha, take out the main points, and then put them in such a way that they can be easily remembered and transmitted. And one of the ways of doing so is by using stock phrases, which means they are repetitive phrases and passages that occur. So that's why we have this Cittānupassanā formula with the first general principle that is repeated countless times in the Tipitaka. Whatever we have now that is available are not the exact words of the Buddha, but these were the main points that were taught by the Buddha. They were compiled and put in such a way for easy and efficient transmission. Another point to understand is that the Buddha was a linguist and he taught in many different dialects. He would teach one dialect in one village and another in another village and so forth. Different monks from different areas, from different localities, memorized his teachings in various dialects. It was quite a challenge for them to agree on a common dialect to preserve the teachings of the Buddha as a whole. To give you an analogy, as though the Buddha was preaching in China. He would preach in Hokkien when he's in the Fujian province. He would teach in Cantonese when he's in Guangdong. And then when he goes to Hainan, he would teach in Hainanese. He goes to Shanghai, he will teach in Shanghainese, and so forth. And so, in the end, when all these teachings were collected after the Buddha passed away, and even during the Buddha's time, I don't know whether during the Buddha's time the teachings were transmitted in a single language like what we have now, because there is a particular place in the Vinaya where a group of Brahmins, because they were trained in the Vedic traditions, where the Vedas were memorized and they were all put in verses. So they suggested to the Buddha that one should versify his teachings just like they did for the Vedas, and also in Sanskrit. See, this is how the commentaries interpret that particular passage. But then the Buddha said, no, I do not allow you to do that. I do not allow you to versify my teachings. I allow monks to study the Dhamma according to their own dialect. During the Buddha's time, you can imagine that different monks from different localities would be memorizing and transmitting the teachings in their respective dialects. But after the Buddha passed away, there was this big council where they decided to rehearse the Buddha's teachings all at once in chorus, which means to say 500 monks recite together the teachings of the Buddha. In such a case, then you need to standardize your dialect. If each one recites the Dhamma in his own dialect, then there will be cacophony, right? In order to recite it harmoniously, they have to come to a decision. And it will take some time for them to decide which language to preserve his teachings. Finally, they settled for what we have now. We call it Pali. It wasn't any dialect that the Buddha actually spoke at that time. It is actually a hybrid of different dialects. That was how the suttas were compiled, and they were preserved for over 500 years. It was only much later that these were written down on palm leaves and transmitted, and finally now we have it digitalized, which makes life very easy for doing research. So you cannot take every sutta at face value because of the way they were preserved and transmitted, and also throughout the ages there could have been additions and omissions. So that's why when you study the sutta, not one single sutta, but many suttas, then you begin to see discrepancies and certain similarities and differences, and then you can try to reconcile them. For example, there's this Venerable Dr. Analayo. He's a retired academician in Germany, a German monk. He's a linguist. He knows Pali, English, German, Sanskrit, ancient Chinese, and Tibetan. And so he has the ability to compare the different versions of the suttas. Some of them were parallels. And then the rule of thumb is that if there's something common to be found in all the different traditions, this must be the root teachings of the Buddha. If there's some deviant readings, additions or omissions, then this is suspect. So that's why in the appendix, you can see the different versions of the Satipatthana material. Some of them overlap and some don't. But then in order to differentiate what is authentic and what is not, and what is useful and what is not, it's not easy, because you need to be a scholar, you need to be knowledgeable, to have a wide range of suttas in order to come to any conclusion. Being lay persons, I don't think that you would have the time or the inclination or the ability to do so. And so for most lay people, I guess you will have to depend on your teacher. And even if you do have the time and inclination, you are only able to read translations of the Pali scriptures, not the actual Pali itself. As you can see in my brief summary, there can be misleading interpretations, especially if the translators are not monks and are not Dhamma practitioners. Particularly those very early English translations of the Pali texts that were published by the Pali Text Society. These were done by ancient scholars who were not monks, nor were they practitioners. These can be quite misleading, but nowadays we have better translations, particularly from monk scholars who are also practitioners, like Venerable Analayo, as well as Bhante Bhikkhu Bodhi and Achan Thanisaro. However, Achan Thanisaro is a rather unconventional translator, and he uses very unconventional terms to translate the Pali. And if you're not familiar with the Pali terms, you can get confused. Since it's so difficult to find someone who is learned as well as experienced in practice, then if you do find someone who is ambidextrous in both these fields, then make sure that you try to understand and retain whatever teachings he or she has to offer, so that you can practice the Dhamma more effectively. Thirdly, what is the nature and scope of Cittānupassanā? As I said, the nature of Cittānupassanā in the wider sense is to observe and identify mental states as wholesome or unwholesome. That is the most general. From there, whether it's wholesome or unwholesome, then you have many subcategories. that will vary according to temperament and situation. And then, what is the scope of Cittānupassanā? The scope of Cittānupassanā includes its development and the way to do so. So what is its development? The development of Cittānupassanā is by repeatedly observing the nature of the origination and vanishing of the mind. And how do you do that? You can only do that effectively if you follow the Noble Eightfold Path, which means to say that the Noble Eightfold Path is a necessary prerequisite for you to be able to practice the development of Cittānupassanā, which is repeatedly observing the nature of the origination and vanishing of the citta. Okay, so this is my final conclusion, and I hope that everything is clear, and I've repeated many times my message regarding this, the theme of this Sutta study with meditation workshop.